Hello everyone, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jesse, or Jess to my friends. And this is a friendly place, so yeah, call me Jess. Those of you who do know me and have watched a few of my other videos, you probably recognize this guy. As far back as I can remember, I've called him Ralph. He's appeared as a character in quite a few episodes of my other show, Did I Get What I Paid For? There, he's portrayed as a long-forgotten favorite childhood toy turned self-proclaimed ruler of every basement in the state of Maryland. The fact that he sounds like Wallace Shawn is one of many mysteries about Ralph that I just don't understand. And there are a lot of them. Everything in the universe, whether it be a great pyramid, a tree, a stick, or a rock, has a story. Almost all of them can be pretty interesting if you stop and take a look at it. And that got me thinking to myself, what is Ralph? Where did he come from? How did I come to get him? Why, when so many of my other childhood toys were either given away to relatives, broke almost immediately after I got them out of the box, or simply didn't survive my friends' annual action figure extravaganzas of 1990 to 1993, why is Ralph one of the few toys I still have 40 years after I got him? So, I went out to answer some of these questions. I wish I could say I was able to answer all of them, or that some of what I found didn't lead me to even more questions, but that's the kind of story I have for you today. The first thing I did was check Ralph's tag. There I was able to find where he was made, which was South Korea. There was a copyright date, 1979. I always assumed I was older than Ralph, but I guess I was wrong. Then there was the name of the company involved in his creation, KY International, though I'm still not sure if they were the manufacturer or an import company. But I had their address, so just on a whim, I decided to do a Google search and came up with nothing. Duh. There's still a lot of time left on this video. If I was able to find info on KY International on the first go, this video would be about 3 minutes long. No, what I found was this building was now involved in the import of valuable ore. This is where most people would give up. They'd say, yeah, this was your favorite toy back when you were a baby. It's cool that you still have it. Its value is entirely sentimental. The answers you're looking for aren't there. Don't bother looking for them. But did I stop? Oh no! Boredom and lack of employment can lead to some rather strange hobbies. One of them is watching reruns of an old PBS show called History Detectives. I still consider it one of the most fascinating educational shows ever made. Every time someone on that show had a mystery item that they wanted to know more about, they sent an email or something to the History Detectives. But the show has been off the air for years and I still wanted answers. I would need an expert. Now, I watch a lot of YouTube videos on toys, but I only knew of one channel that was run by someone who had worked in the toy industry at some point. That's a channel called Spectre Creative. Scott Knightlick, the guy who runs the channel, will on occasion try to figure out the origins of toy oddities. He did a lot of the coverage on the Wonder Bread He-Man story a while back. Not only that, the few other videos he's done on the subject end with request for more mysteries and that he'd be willing to take on the case if it were weird enough. Ralph is, well, He looks like a cross between a prayer doll and a Muppet, which doesn't explain the pajamas or the nightcap. Just look at him. Nothing about Ralph makes any sense whatsoever. That doesn't make me love him any less, but I get how weird he might look from an outsider's perspective. I knew finding any new information would be a long shot, but I knew Scott was probably the best hope I had of finding anything. So I took a chance and sent him an email. I took a few fashion shots of Ralph and sent them along. He said he had no idea what this was, but he knew of groups on Facebook, Reddit, and Discord that handled this sort of thing all the time. But if I found anything, I should keep him in the loop. I went to a few of the Facebook groups he suggested. The first one pointed me toward a back corner of the internet. The site looked kinda sketchy. I lived in the Baltimore suburbs for 4 years, so I know sketchy. This place was about as hinky a website as anyone would want to visit without using a Tor extension, about a zillion firewalls, and then nuking their virtual machine from orbit because it's the only way to be sure. But it let me check the history of the address on Ralph's tag going back decades, using city, state, and federal records. This is the kind of information that companies and private investigation services charge big bucks for, but it cost me nothing. The last reference I could find to KY International was in 1986, 7 years after Old Ralphie was made. What I found was a patent application for something called Talking Baby Alive. I can't prove the toy was ever released or sold, but I found the paperwork for a talking baby doll that used microchips. Two things struck me about that. One, none of the KY International toys I saw in those records had any sort of electronics. Having a talking baby doll, yeah, that makes sense. This was the 80s. Every toy company out there wanted in on the talking toy gimmick. Worlds of Wonder had both Teddy Ruxpin and Talking Mickey. Ertl had electronic talking Alf. Gans Toys made Talking Wrinkles the dog. The second was, this was 1986. Putting microchips in toys and making them talk was a new thing. I mean, not new, but new enough. Those types of things could not have been cheap to do, which in my mind painted a pretty good picture of what happened. Let's just look at what we know. In the 60s and 70s, there were lots of small toy companies. By the 80s, not so much. There were fewer and fewer small toy manufacturers as the big companies merged together. KY International was making pretty good money with cheap plush dolls for grocery stores or whatever. They weren't raking in big bucks like Kalika with their Cabbage Patch Kids or those critters from Cleveland with their zillions of franchises like Care Bears, Popples, and My Pet Monster. So I'm guessing that in order to compete with Cabbage Patch Kids and Teddy Ruxpin, they decided to go for broke and put every dime they had on Baby Alive. It either made it to shelves in a limited capacity and bombed, or they went bankrupt just doing the R&D and the toy never got to stores. So this little toy company, which at that point had been around for at least 7 years, went belly up. I was about to email Scott about all this when I found something even more bizarre. Another user on the Facebook group sent me a link to a whole slew of toys made by KY International. It turns out Talking Baby Alive was just the tip of the iceberg. The doll had been around for decades, and this was at least its third iteration. The original was produced in the late 1950s or early 1960s. Baby Alive was a baby doll where, if you lay it down, it closed its eyes. When you picked it up, the eyes would open. It was, well, kinda creepy and uncanny valley. They later introduced a version where you could give it a bottle. It would actually drink it. But it wasn't one of those trick glasses that you see with a lot of other baby dolls or in a magic act. No, this baby doll would take a drink and within 2 to 5 minutes wet itself. Nor were these the only toys that KY International produced. On top of that, they had a knockoff Big Wheel. They had a toy truck that looked like it was made by Little Tikes. Well, if Little Tikes dump trucks had a bed so flimsy that it would snap if you tried to load it up with anything heavier than feathers, and dumping anything would snap the entire truck in half. Well, this was kind of interesting and proved this company wasn't fly by night, so maybe, just maybe, there was more information out there if I looked hard enough. It seemed odd since none of the other toys looked like Ralph at all. I took what I found out to Scott to see if at least my theory about why the company no longer exists seemed probable to him. I mean, I have a degree in advertising, public relations, and marketing. Unfortunately, I've never gotten a job in the field, but I understand the basic principles and stuff like that. Just maybe not to the degree that he does. And he said,
Oh, it absolutely makes sense. A lot of smaller toy companies went bust trying stuff like that in the 1980s.
"Oh boy, our quest for truth doesn't stop there, folks. A third person suggested I try searching for KY International toys on sites like eBay and Etsy. This led me down an insane rabbit hole that boggles my mind. It started with the Etsy page of someone who called themselves the Pink Room. They had these for sale. Look at the fabric they are made of. Look at the hair. Look at the clothing. It reminded me so much of Ralph, only their noses were a tad more realistic. These dolls were almost certainly Ralph's cousins. Not only that, there was another bit of weirdness. Ralph was made by KY International. These dolls were made by KY International in partnership with Raspberry Inc. So anyway, I thought I was getting somewhere. After all, Raspberry was big. Or at least it used to be huge. If you were a kid from the 1960s to maybe the early 2000s, you probably had at least one toy from Raspberry Inc. or one of their subsidiaries. Their stuffed animals raised grocery stores, Hallmark stores, dollar stores, hospital gift shops. You name a place that sold cheap plush toys, Raspberry Inc. had you covered. And if you didn't own one of their plush toys, you probably had a troll doll. Yes, I know, Thomas Dam invented the troll. Due to a screw up on his part, he didn't initially trademark the troll doll in North America, which was a multi-million-dollar oopsie that led to a lot of knockoffs. The most popular of these were made by, you guessed it, Raspberry. Most troll dolls sold in the US between 1963 and 2,000 were made from Russ Berry designs. Even the trolls in Toy Story used the Berry design, not dams. But upon further digging, I saw that Berry's headquarters and distribution centers were in New Jersey and New York. So, a little problem with that theory. KY International was out in California. So at first I thought, oh, it was probably like Girl Scout cookies, where you have several distributors handling them in different parts of the country. Russ handled the East Coast, KY International handled the West Coast, and maybe the Midwest. I've had Ralph longer than I can remember. I think we even have photos of him when I still lived in Ohio. Looking into Russ Berry's history, I began to suspect that wasn't the case. In the late 70s and early 80s, Russ expanded. They had a West Coast office. Remember the website I used to find out the history of the building that Ralph supposedly came from? I decided to go back there and use it to look up Russ Berry's old address in California, and you'll never guess what I found. Yep, one of the distribution centers was the same building. And it wasn't a case where KY International operated out of Suite F and Russ Berry operated out of Suite B. It was the same building, same suite number, which makes total sense. Russ Berry Inc. was founded in 1963. They started small, but by 1973 they were huge. By the 80s, they or their subsidiaries were synonymous with plush toys. How they accomplished this expansion so fast was straight out of the movie Wall Street. They found their weakest competitor and bought them out. They'd be contractually obligated to use the company's name and backstock for a certain amount of time. Berry would continue making any of the acquisitions that sold well enough and just discontinue the rest. Other times, he'd just wait for the competitor to collapse on their own and pick up their IP for a song. At first, I was 90% sure that's what happened here. But that's not all I found. It gets weirder. I was flipping through the book about Jim Henson by Brian Jones, double checking a few facts for an upcoming episode of Did I Get What I Paid For that I plan to do sometime this year. But I came across something interesting. Jim Henson was never happy with the standard Muppet plush dolls that Fisher-Price was making. Their heads were a little flat, their noses were off, and on characters like Ernie and Bert, their mouths were iron-on stickers. Henson licensed out some higher-end Muppet plushes to a company called Knickerbocker Toys, which became Applause Inc. And at the end of its existence, Applause Inc. was owned by Russ Berry Inc. So I thought, is this why no one knows what Ralph is? I mean, his nose is sort of similar to the early Applause Sesame Street toys. Is it some sort of bootleg Muppet made by the parent company of the company making the real deal? So they slapped the name of a faltering subsidiary on it so that Henson wouldn't know they were involved? Again, I contacted Scott and he said,
Interesting theory, and it's quite possible.
I had all but settled on this theory when even more information came to my attention. Knickerbocker Toys had problems with distribution, but they had a bunch of licenses that a company called Wallaceberry Toys desperately wanted. So the companies quietly merged. And as fate would have it, Wallaceberry was Russ Berry's brother. So you're thinking, oh, it's still in the family. Right. And you'd be wrong. See, there's a reason why Wallace Berry changed the name to Applause. The two brothers were on again, off again business partners back in the 60s and 70s, and things had gone south. By 1976, the two brothers were barely speaking and only in business together because their lawyers couldn't find a way to fully disentangle their business partnerships without causing massive chaos for both of them. Thus, Russ Berry couldn't have produced a bootleg of something he already had the right to. That theory was out. So, just what is Ralphie anyway? I got another theory presented to me by someone on those Facebook groups. See, they didn't think Ralph was wearing an old-fashioned nightcap. They insisted that it was a tam o' shanter, which is a type of hat traditionally worn by men in Scotland. They hypothesized that Ralph was actually a character who was some forgotten piece of Scottish pop culture, which seems a bit unlikely, but I can't dismiss it outright. My grandfather traveled to and from the UK quite a number of times in his life, particularly in the late 70s to early 90s. At one point, my grandparents had even considered moving there permanently. So it's possible while he was there, he picked him up for me as a souvenir. But something was nagging at me, and I realized what it was. If my grandfather got it for me in Scotland, why the distribution center in California? You're telling me a company in Scotland hires a Korean company to make the toy, and they send it to California, and then it goes to Scotland? That doesn't make much sense. And then I found one or two more bits of the puzzle that make a lot more sense. And it all goes back to that company, Applause Inc. Yes, it was sort of born out of the merger of Knickerbocker Toys and Wallace Berry Toys. At the end of its lifespan, it was part of the Kid Brand's Russ Berry Company. And once upon a time, Wallace Berry Toys and Russ Berry Toys were more or less indistinguishable. So what happened? In the 70s, Russ Berry got a little fed up with merchandising screw-ups and shipping delays and whatnot. He decided that he was going to move away from just designing and importing toys to actually doing the manufacturing in-house. Those plants were located all over the world. South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, wherever he could get it done cheap. This move, while it led to fewer errors and faster shipping, was very expensive. So expensive that it almost took down not only Russ Berry Inc., but some of the companies that had partnerships with them, like Wallace Berry Inc. This was what led Wallace Berry to become so displeased that he slowly but surely divested his money from his brother's company, forcing Russ Berry to sell the factories and go back to doing things the way they had before. And since he couldn't pay his bills, his brother made him an offer to let him take control of the California side of the company and consider the debt paid. However, this process wasn't completed until 1980. After that, they were fierce competitors for almost a decade, at least until Wallace Berry got out of the toy game sometime between 1988 and 1990. How fierce was the competition? I mentioned how Russ Berry kinda sorta abused a glitch in international copyright laws that existed at the time to take control of the Trolls brand in North America. Wallace Berry wanted some of that sweet, sweet, cutesy toy money. The story goes that he took a vacation to France or Belgium in 1978. There he discovered these kids collecting these figurines and comic books featuring blue creatures that looked like this. Familiar? Wallace Berry tracked down the creator of the Belgian cartoonist Peo and secured the North American license to all toys based on these creatures. And some sources say at least a stake in the US animation rights. That's right, Wallace Berry brought the Smurfs to America. Now, it can be argued that, yeah, seeing how all the French and Belgian children love the Smurfs, he'd have been an idiot to not try replicating that in the US. The fact that he could do that and beat his brother at his own game was just icing on the cake. But that's not the only case of them acting like, well, feuding little kids. If Wallace Berry landed a contract making toys for McDonald's, then Russ Berry immediately entered negotiations with Burger King. If Russ Berry made a Curious George doll, Wallace Berry would go talk to Dr. Seuss. Which led me to a hypothesis that is going to sound absolutely bonkers. I can't prove it, but it just sort of makes sense. Wallace Berry wanted the Muppets license and wanted it bad. What's the best thing you could do if you wanted to screw your rival out of a licensing deal worth millions? Simple. You use a company that is part of your joint toy empire and produce knockoffs. How do you think the Jim Henson Company and the Children's Television Workshop would feel seeing the name of a company that people in the industry knew was one of your subsidiaries making bootlegs of the very toy line you were negotiating to produce? Remember, when you pay money for a licensing agreement, that's on you. All the money you put in is just gone if you violate it. I'm pretty sure Bootleg Ernie here would qualify on that front. Ralph was made in 1979, right at the height of these companies not quite getting untangled and being at each other's throats. Remember how I said Ralph wasn't quite a bootleg made by the company that later went on to make the real deal? I mean, he sorta is, but I think it's weirder than that. I think Ralph was an attempt by Russ Berry to create knockoff Muppets made by a company known to be part of the Berry toy empire. An empire that, at the time, Wallace Berry was, at least on paper, still co-owner. And if that company was caught making bootleg Muppets, it might cost Wallace Berry the licensing deal, leaving him on the hook for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. Of course, I went to ask Scott about this, and he said,
While the Berry brothers might have threatened each other with various legal actions a few times, that seems like a bit of a stretch.
are any of these possibilities true? I really don't know. I don't entirely know what to believe. But this is where this little story ends. Usually I try to wrap these up with a humorous quip, a wraparound, or some sort of point. But this time I can't do that. Unless someone comes across this video and can give me more information, it's really all I have to say. If I can get more information, this video will definitely get a follow-up. But if you can clarify anything or know anything more, please leave a comment. Before I go, I just want to say thank you. First, everyone on those Facebook, Reddit, and Discord groups who tried to find more information for me. It's not your fault that with a 41-year-old doll, there's not much to find. And of course, a super duper thank you to Scott Toy Guru Nightlick over at Vector Creative. I could not have made this video without his assistance. Not just in terms of pointing me in the right direction of where to find information and giving me a little encouragement to keep looking for clues, and let's face it, he stopped me from going down quite a number of rabbit holes. That was invaluable in and of itself. But he was kind enough to lend his own voice to the video. Now, you guys know me. I rarely try to play pitchman for anything other than my own Patreon. But if you're into toys and you're not watching the Spectre Creative channel, you're missing out. I can't recommend them enough. There's some really cool stuff there. And if you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. Toy fans, most of my videos aren't like this, but you should still hit like and subscribe anyway because my movie review show uses a lot of toys in unusual ways. And if you really want to see this channel grow, visit patreon.com/parodyerrorfilms and become a patron.